She was 51 years old, scarred, and carrying a box that powerful men would kill to destroy. They said she was unstable, dangerous, a bitter woman who couldn't let go. They were right about one thing. She couldn't let go. Because inside that rusted metal box lived the confessions of a monster. Names, dates, signatures, proof that could bring down one of the most respected men on the frontier. And he knew she had it. That's why they were already writing. Drop the name of your city in the comments. Let's see how far Evelyn's story travels. The night the last train didn't come, Evelyn Mercer stood alone on the platform of Caldwell Crossing and understood, with the hollow clarity of someone who had survived too many disasters, that the universe owed her absolutely nothing. Wind cut across the open plains like a blade with a grudge. The station lanterns swayed on their iron hooks, throwing sick orange light across the warped wooden planks of the platform, making shadows that twisted and lunged. There were maybe a dozen other travelers stranded that evening. A traveling salesman in a brown coat, a young family huddled near their luggage, two cattle buyers arguing loudly about nothing. But they all managed to give Evelyn a wide berth, the way people naturally cleared space around something they couldn't quite name but instinctively feared. She was used to it. She had been used to it for 6 years. The right side of her face was fine, strong jaw, dark eyes that had once been called beautiful by a man who later tried to use them as kindling. But the left side told a different story, a story written in puckered, reddened scar tissue that ran from her temple down to her jawline, a story of fire and kerosene and a locked bedroom door. Children stared openly. Adults looked away. Both reactions felt like the same thing in the end. The station master, a round-bellied man named Hicks, came out to make the announcement with the apologetic energy of someone delivering bad news he had personally caused. "Lines washed out north of Redfield Creek," he called out, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "Flash flooding took out 2 miles of track this afternoon. No trains until morning. Maybe longer." A collective groan moved through the small crowd. "What are we supposed to do?" the young mother demanded, her voice sharp with exhaustion. She had a baby on her hip and a 3-year-old clinging to her skirt. "We have nowhere to go." "The Miller Inn is 3 blocks east," Hicks offered, already retreating toward the warmth of his station office. "Reasonably priced." Evelyn didn't move. She stood with both hands wrapped around the handle of the battered metal box that she'd been carrying for 3 weeks. Carrying it the way soldiers carry ammunition, or the way drowning people grip pieces of wreckage. Like letting go would mean dying. The Miller Inn was 3 blocks away, yes. She knew it. She had stayed there 7 years ago, passing through with her husband, back when she was still the respectable wife of Harlan Mercer, back before she understood what kind of man she had married. The innkeeper there, a Mrs. Dalloway, had smiled at Harlan and barely looked at Evelyn, the way most women did when Harlan was in the room. She reached into her coat pocket with her free hand and touched the small fold of bills she'd been living on for the past month. $14.30. She had done the math so many times it felt like a prayer. Room at the Miller Inn would cost $2, minimum. She needed every cent she could hold on to for what came after. She sat down on the cold wooden bench at the far end of the platform and pulled the metal box into her lap and waited for a plan to arrive. None came. The other travelers dispersed gradually. The family toward the inn, the salesman toward the saloon down the road, the cattle buyers climbing into a waiting wagon that someone had arranged to collect them. Within 20 minutes, Evelyn was alone on the platform with the swaying lanterns and the rising wind and the sound of the distant plains settling into their cold night rhythms. She had slept outside before. She could do it again. She was mentally calculating whether the station overhang would provide enough shelter from the wind when she heard boots on the platform behind her. Her whole body went rigid. In 6 years of running, she had learned that footsteps approaching from behind were almost never good news. She turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral, her left hand tightening on the box. The man who stood at the other end of the platform was somewhere in his early 60s, with the kind of face that weather and work carve into something interesting rather than something old. Deep lines around his eyes, broad through the shoulders in a way that had less to do with vanity than with decades of actual labor. He wore a coat that had been good quality 15 years ago and a hat that had been through considerable weather. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen directed her way in a very long time. Not pity, not fear, not the barely concealed revulsion that she'd learned to ignore. Just attention. The quiet kind. He held up a hand in a gesture that was clearly meant to be non-threatening. Sorry to startle you. I'm not... He paused, choosing his words. I'm heading back to my ranch. It's about 4 miles east. I've got a fire going and more soup than one man needs. Another pause. The offer is exactly what it sounds like. Warm food and a roof. Nothing attached to it. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment. Why? She said. He seemed to consider that seriously, which she hadn't expected. My mother used to say that leaving someone in the cold when you don't have to is a sin against basic human decency. She was an extremely firm woman, and her voice is still in my head after 40 years. A ghost of something. Not quite a smile, but close. My name is Garrett Boone. I run cattle about 4 miles east of here, have done for 30 years. You can ask Hicks in there about me if you want. Evelyn looked at the station door, then back at Garrett Boone. I don't trust strangers, she said. That's sensible, he replied. I don't trust kindness from strangers. Also sensible, given how the world works. He didn't flinch, didn't push. The offer stands. My wagon's around the side of the station. If you decide you'd rather take your chances out here, I completely understand. He turned and walked around the corner of the building without looking back. Evelyn sat very still for 30 seconds. She thought about the $14.30. She thought about the Miller Inn. She thought about Mrs. Dalloway's thin smile and the $2 she couldn't afford. She thought about the riders who had followed her from Benton County, the ones she'd spotted 3 days ago. 2 of them, big men on dark horses, maintaining a distance that was careful enough to be professional. She had lost them in a cattle town called Pryor's Bend, but losing someone wasn't the same as shaking them. She picked up the metal box and walked around the side of the building. Garrett Boone was sitting on the bench of a modest wagon, 2 bay horses standing patient in the traces. He didn't look triumphant or even particularly relieved when she appeared. He simply reached behind him and moved a rolled-up blanket to make room on the bench. It's a cold ride, he said. You might want to wrap up. The ranch was exactly what he'd described. 4 miles east, sitting low against a ridge that blocked the worst of the north wind. A solid house, a good barn, a stone fireplace that had been burning since morning and had turned the main room into the kind of warmth that makes you feel, briefly, like nothing outside can reach you. Garrett had put soup on before he'd left for Caldwell Crossing. Bean and salt pork, thick and plain and exactly right for a freezing October night. He set a bowl in front of her at the table without ceremony and poured coffee so dark it was nearly black. Evelyn sat with the metal box on the floor pressed against her right ankle and ate without speaking. Garrett ate across from her and didn't push conversation, which she noted. Most people couldn't tolerate silence. They filled it with questions, with pleasantries, with little social negotiations that were really just attempts to get information. Garrett seemed to have made peace with quiet a long time ago. The box, he said finally, when she'd finished the soup and was working on her second cup of coffee. She looked at him. It's chained to your wrist in everything but fact, he said. I'm not asking what's in it. I'm just noticing. Good, she said. Don't ask. He nodded. Fair enough. She slept that night on a cot in the small back room that he said had been a sewing room when his wife was alive. He didn't elaborate on the wife, and she didn't ask. There was a blanket that smelled like cedar, and a window that looked out on the dark plains, and the very far spill of stars across a sky so clear it almost hurt. Evelyn lay on her back with the metal box on the floor beside the cot, her fingers resting lightly on its edge, and did not sleep for a long time. She ran through what she knew. Harlan had at least 3 men, probably more, who were loyal to him in the way that certain men are loyal to power and money, which is to say, completely and without ethics. She had escaped his house in the middle of the night 18 months ago, had spent the months since hiding and moving and building a case, quietly gathering witnesses who were too afraid to testify but willing to write things down. 12 letters. 12 women. 12 separate accounts of the same pattern, the same cruelty, the same careful destruction. She had been trying to reach Judge Aldous Prine in Harmon City for 6 months. He was one of the only territorial judges with a reputation for not being in someone's pocket. Every route she'd tried had dead-ended. Someone always seemed to know she was coming. Twice she'd had to abandon plans at the last moment after catching sight of Harlan's men. 3rd attempt. Last resources. Everything riding on getting those letters in front of a judge before Harlan found her first. She closed her eyes. She thought about the scar on her face and how, in the early days after it happened, she used to turn away from mirrors. How she had stood in a boarding house bathroom in some forgettable town and made herself look at it for the first time, really look, and had felt not shame, but something closer to recognition. This was the truth of her life made visible, the truth she'd been hiding for 15 years of marriage, made legible in scar tissue. She was 51 years old. She was exhausted down to her marrow. Her hands ached from cold and her feet had blisters from miles of walking. She was also, underneath all of it, furious in a way that had burned clean and steady for 18 months without going out. Sleep, when it finally came, was dark and dreamless. She woke to the sound of horses. Not Garrett's horses. They were in the barn, and she'd already learned the sound they made, the comfortable shuffle of animals in familiar stalls. These were different, more than two, moving with the particular deliberate pace of riders who didn't want to be heard. It was still dark. The window showed a sky just barely thinking about going gray. Evelyn was on her feet with the metal box in her hand before she'd fully processed the thought. She moved to the bedroom door, opened it silently. Garrett was already in the main room, standing to one side of the front window, looking out with the flat, calm expression of a man who had assessed dangerous situations before. "How many?" she whispered. "3," he said quietly. "Hanging back at the tree line. They've been there about 10 minutes. They're waiting for daylight," she said. "They'll move when they can see clearly." He turned to look at her then, really look for the first time since she'd arrived, and she could see him doing the math. 3 men at the tree line before dawn. A woman who'd been on a platform alone at midnight with a box chained to her soul. He was connecting things without asking for an explanation. "There a back way out?" she asked. "Through the barn, connects to a ravine about 200 yards south. Ravine runs east, comes out near the old Morrison Creek Trail." He paused. "It's a rough ride in the dark." "Rougher if we wait?" she said. He looked at her for another second. Then something in his expression settled into a decision, and he moved toward the back of the house. "There's a rifle by the barn door," he said over his shoulder, his voice low and steady. "I'll saddle the horses. You bring that box." Evelyn followed him through the back door and into the cold dark of the pre-dawn prairie, her boots silent on the frost-stiffened grass, the metal box gripped in both hands. Behind them, at the tree line, the riders were still waiting. They didn't wait much longer. The ravine was black as a mine shaft and twice as unforgiving. Garrett had gotten 2 horses saddled in under 4 minutes, a gray mare for Evelyn and his own buckskin gelding, a horse named Cutter that seemed to understand urgency the way some animals do, ears forward, feet already moving before his rider had fully settled into the saddle. They'd gone out the back of the barn in silence, walking the horses slow through the frozen grass until the darkness of the ravine swallowed them whole. And only then had Garrett clicked his tongue and let Cutter move into something faster. Evelyn rode hard and did not look back. She could hear them, though. A shout from the direction of the ranch house, distant but sharp in the cold air. Then another voice, lower, giving orders. The sound of horses breaking from the tree line. They'd been seen, or the missing horses had been discovered, which amounted to the same thing. The ravine trail was narrow and treacherous in the dark, the ground frozen into ridges and ruts that grabbed at the horses' hooves. Garrett rode ahead, relying on memory more than sight, calling back warnings in a low voice. Rock left, low branch, soft ground coming. And Evelyn followed with the metal box tucked under her left arm and her right hand steady on the reins, moving by feel and instinct and sheer will. They rode for 40 minutes before Garrett slowed and finally stopped at the point where the ravine opened out onto a wider trail. He listened. Nothing behind them now except wind and the distant sound of the plains. He turned his horse to look at her. In the gray beginning of dawn, his face was unreadable, but his eyes were steady. "You want to tell me who those men are?" he said. It was not an accusation. It was the question of someone who had just ridden blind through a frozen ravine before sunrise and felt he'd earned at least part of the truth. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She had kept the story locked up for so long that the habit of silence felt almost physical. A door she'd reinforced from the inside, brick by brick, until opening it required more than just decision. It required trust. And trust, after 15 years of learning what it cost, did not come easily. But Garrett Boone had not asked a single question the night before. He had moved when she said move. He had not panicked in the dark. He had called back warnings so she wouldn't fall. My husband sent them, she said. Garrett waited. My former husband, Harlan Mercer. She said the name the way you say the name of a disease. Clinical, careful, like the word itself has weight. He was, a land broker in Benton County. Very respected, very well connected. He was on the county development board for 12 years. He gave money to every civic project, shook every hand, knew the name of every banker's wife. She paused. He was also systematically destroying women. Not always with violence, sometimes just with money, reputation, legal pressure, isolating them, breaking them down. When that wasn't enough, she stopped. He used fire, Garrett said quietly. Her left hand moved, almost involuntarily, to the scarred side of her face. Then she caught herself and lowered it. He locked the bedroom door, she said. He thought I was already unconscious. I wasn't. She said it flatly, the way people state facts that have been looked at so many times they've lost their ability to shock. I broke the window. I got out. He told everyone I'd had an episode, that I'd been unstable for years, that I'd started the fire myself in a hysterical rage. A cold, humorless breath that wasn't quite a laugh. People believed him. He was so credible. I was just his difficult wife. Garrett said nothing for a moment. The dawn was coming up slowly now, pale light spreading across the open ground. What's in the box? He said. Letters, she said. 12 of them, from 12 different women. Written accounts of what he did to them. Dates, details, specific incidents. Things that could only be known if you'd lived through them. She looked down at the metal box resting against her saddle. He spent 2 years looking for me. Because as long as those letters exist and I'm alive to deliver them, everything he's built can come down. Where are you trying to get to? Harmon City. There's a judge there. Aldous Prine. I was told he's honest. Garrett absorbed this. His eyes moved to the trail behind them, still empty, then back to her face. Harmon City is 6 days' ride from here, he said. Through mountain territory. October. I know. The passes will be getting ice. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. You were planning to do this alone. I've been doing everything alone for 18 months, she said. I've gotten reasonably good at it. The silence between them was different from the silences of the night before. This one had weight. Garrett turned his horse slowly, looking at the trail that stretched east toward the mountains, and Evelyn watched him think. I know a route, he said finally. Avoids the main passes, longer but less traveled. Men who are tracking someone usually stick to the roads. He gathered his reins. I also know a place we can stop and resupply without going through any town large enough to have eyes in it. Evelyn stared at him. You're offering to come. I'm saying I know the route, he said, with that same careful precision she'd noticed the night before. Never overselling, never pushing. What you do with that information is entirely your business. She thought about the riders. 3 of them, well organized, positioned before dawn. Harlan's men didn't stumble onto things. They planned. They had resources. She had been moving alone and managing, but she had also burned through nearly every contingency she'd built, and the closer she got to Harmon City, the more danger would consolidate. A man who knew the back routes, who had moved calmly through the dark, who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Don't fall behind, she said, and turned the gray mare east. Something that might have been a smile crossed Garrett's face, brief as a shadow. He followed. They rode in silence through the first morning, moving through open range that gradually gave way to rougher country as the land began to climb. Garrett set a steady pace, not rushed, not careless, the pace of someone who understood that distance was won over hours, not by burning out the horses in the first stretch. Evelyn matched it. She was a competent rider, which she could see surprised him slightly, though he was polite enough not to say so. Around midday, they stopped near a creek to water the horses and eat from the provisions Garrett had thrown into his saddlebags before they'd left. Dried beef, hardtack, 2 apples that had gone slightly soft but were still sweet enough to matter. They sat on opposite sides of the creek bank without discussing it, both keeping the crossing between them and the trail they'd come from. How long were you married? Garrett asked, not looking at her, watching the horses drink. 15 years, Evelyn said. Married at 33, which everyone told me was already dangerously close to being too old. She bit into the apple. Harlan seemed like the answer to a problem I'd been told I had. When did you know? She considered the question seriously. Fully know? 3 years in, but there were signs earlier. There always are. She paused. I was very skilled at explaining things away, at deciding that what I'd seen wasn't what I'd seen. We do that. She said it without self-reproach, simply as a statement of human behavior. We build stories that let us keep living with the choices we've made. Garrett was quiet for a moment. My wife died 8 years ago, he said. Fever. Came on fast and didn't let go. He turned a piece of hardtack over in his hands. We had 22 years. Good ones, mostly. I know that's not the same as what you're describing. I just mean, he seemed to search for the right words and not quite find them. I understand what it is to live beside someone and not quite be able to see them clearly until you have distance. Evelyn looked at him across the creek. There was nothing performative in what he'd said. No attempt to draw a parallel that flattered him or diminished her. Just a man being honest about the limits of his own vision. She looked back at the horses. The first letter I received was from a woman named Clara Beach, she said. She found me through a mutual acquaintance. She'd heard I'd left Harlan, and she wrote to me, a very short letter, only half a page, saying that she'd known him in the years before he married me, that he had ruined her family's finances through a fraudulent land agreement, and that when her father had threatened legal action, Harlan had produced forged documents that made it look like the fraud was on their side. Her father lost everything trying to fight it. The case nearly killed him. She was quiet for a second. She said she'd been waiting years for someone who might believe her. She didn't say what that letter had done to her, what it meant to hold someone else's pain and recognize it as a mirror. She didn't need to. Something in Garrett's expression told her he understood. After Clara, others found me, she continued. Word moves through certain channels when women are looking for each other. By the end, I had 12 letters. Some of them are... She stopped, steadied herself. Some of them described things that should never have happened to anyone, and every single one of those women was dismissed or discredited or simply too frightened to speak publicly. Harlan is very good at making women feel that no one will believe them. He's had a lot of practice. Garrett stood, brushed crumbs from his coat. Then we make sure someone does. It was such a simple thing to say. Not a speech, not a declaration, just the quiet, matter-of-fact statement of a man who had decided something and saw no need to dress it up. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Then she stood and went to her horse. On the third day out, they found the ambush waiting for them. The trail through Kelson's Gap was the safest route through the first ridge of mountains. Garrett had been certain of it, and he wasn't wrong. What he hadn't anticipated was that Harlan's men had been certain of it too. Someone in Caldwell Crossing had talked, or someone further back along the trail had pieced together their direction. Evelyn saw the glint first, a flash of metal in the tree line above the gap, there and gone in less than a second, but her eye had been trained to catch exactly that kind of thing. Stop, she said quietly. Garrett stopped. Up left. Trees. Something's catching light. He didn't turn his head. His eyes moved slowly in the direction she'd indicated. A pause. I see it. How many ways into the gap? The main trail, and there's a switchback cut about 300 yards back. Used to be a logging path. Overgrown now, but passable. He kept his voice completely level. It comes out above the gap, not below. They're expecting us to come through the bottom. Yes. Then we don't. They turned the horses slowly, casually, the way you turn when you've remembered something left behind and decided to go back for it. Nothing hurried. Nothing that screamed awareness. The logging path was exactly what Garrett had promised, overgrown with alder and choked with old brush, but the ground beneath was solid enough. They moved through it in single file, barely faster than a walk, branches dragging at their coats and hats, the horses pushing through with pinned ears and steady feet. 20 minutes later, they came out on the ridge above the gap. Below them, in the bottom of the pass, 2 riders sat motionless among the trees watching the trail. They had the patient stillness of men who had done this before, men who were paid to wait and knew how to do it without fidgeting. Professional, then. Not just ranch hands sent on an errand. Garrett and Evelyn watched them from above for a long moment, the cold wind moving quietly through the pines. He upgraded, Evelyn said under her breath. What?
The men at your ranch, those were local hires. These are something else. She studied the still figures below. He's spending real money now. Garrett looked at her sideways. Should that concern me? It means he's worried, she said. Worried men make mistakes. She turned her horse north along the ridge, away from the gap. Come on, we go over the top. The top of the ridge was brutal. The wind came off the higher peaks with a viciousness that made thinking difficult, and the ground was iced over in patches that sent the horses skidding and scrambling with every third step. Evelyn's hands went numb inside her gloves. Her face, the scarred side in particular, always more sensitive to cold, ached from her temple to her jaw, like something was slowly squeezing it. She said nothing. Garrett watched her from the corner of his eye more than once. She could feel it, that careful, non-intrusive attention that had become familiar over 3 days of riding. When her horse slipped badly on a patch of ice and she grabbed the saddle horn to stay mounted, he moved Cutter alongside her gray without a word, close enough to act as a buffer against the wind and the worst of the exposed slope. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. They came down off the ridge on the far side as the last light was leaving the sky, stiff and cold and wind-raw, and made camp in a sheltered hollow where a stand of old pines had grown together into something almost like a room. Garrett had a fire going in 20 minutes. Evelyn unsaddled both horses without being asked. They sat by the fire and ate in silence. The flames threw their shadows long against the pine trunks. Somewhere far off, a coyote called and was answered. "Can I ask you something?" Garrett said. She looked up. "When you were putting the letters together, all those women, all those stories, what kept you going? Because 18 months is a long time to carry something like that alone." Evelyn looked at the fire for a while before she answered. "Clara Beach," she said finally. Her letter was half a page, but at the bottom, after everything she'd described, all the loss, all the damage, she wrote, "I don't know if anyone will ever read this. I don't know if it matters, but I needed someone to know it happened." She was quiet for a moment. "She needed someone to know it happened," she repeated. "That's all. Not justice, not revenge, not even an apology. Just acknowledgement. Proof that her experience was real." Her jaw tightened briefly. 12 women wrote to me. 12 women who had spent years being told their experiences were not what they had experienced. And I thought, if I stop, if I run, if I hide this box somewhere and disappear, those 12 women will spend the rest of their lives knowing that what happened to them wasn't real enough to matter to anyone. She looked at Garrett directly. "I wasn't going to let that happen," she said. "Whatever else I am, or whatever else I've lost, I was not going to let that happen." The fire snapped and threw a small shower of sparks up into the dark. Garrett nodded, not the nod of someone agreeing to be polite. The nod of someone who has just understood something they will not forget. "Then we'll get you to Harmon City," he said. He did not add or die trying, because it wasn't that kind of statement. It was simpler than that, and harder. It was the kind of thing a person says when they have made a decision in their bones, past the point of doubt. Evelyn looked back at the fire. The metal box sat beside her right boot, as it always did, its surface catching the firelight in dull orange flickers. 12 women needed someone to know. She would make sure someone did. They reached Harmon City on the morning of the 7th day. It did not look like a place where justice lived. It looked like every other frontier town that had grown faster than its own sense of order. A main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass with room to argue about it, storefronts leaning slightly in different directions like men who'd had too much to drink and were quietly negotiating with gravity. The territorial courthouse sat at the far end of the street, 2 stories of sandstone block with a flag above it that the wind had been working on for years. Solid enough, present enough. Evelyn looked at it from the end of the street and felt something shift inside her chest that she didn't quite have a name for. Not relief. Not yet. Something more tentative than that. The held breath of someone who has been running so long that stopping feels like a trap. "Still standing," Garrett said beside her. "So are we," she said. They rode in slow, keeping to the edge of the street, not advertising themselves. Garrett had suggested they find a room first, clean up, and approach the courthouse in the afternoon when the business of the morning court session would be settled and Judge Prine would be in his offices.
Walking in looking like they'd spent a week in the mountains, which they had, would not help Evelyn's credibility, and credibility was the only currency she had left. The hotel they found was modest and clean, run by a compact woman named Mrs. Alcott, who looked at the scar on Evelyn's face for exactly 1 second before deciding it was none of her business, which immediately made Evelyn like her. 2 rooms, cash in advance, hot water brought up in tin pitchers, which was worth more than almost anything else at that moment. Evelyn sat in the small chair beside the wash basin and looked at herself in the mirror while the water cooled to usable. She did this deliberately, had done it deliberately every morning for 6 years, the same act of refusal against the impulse to look away from what the fire had made of her face. The scar ran from her left temple in a wide, irregular path down to the edge of her jaw. The skin there permanently reddened, pulled slightly taut in a way that gave the left side of her expression a cast of severity even when she was feeling something else entirely. She was 51 years old, and she looked it. The weeks of travel had carved new lines around her eyes and mouth. Her dark hair, which she'd worn long her entire adult life, had gone nearly fully gray in the 18 months since she'd left Harlan's house. She thought about what the courtroom would see when she walked in. An aging woman with a burned face and a damaged reputation, trailing accusations against one of Benton County's most beloved civic figures. She had been in that position before, had watched juries and officials and neighbors look at her and make their calculations within the first 30 seconds, long before she'd said a word. She washed her face, changed into the cleanest clothes she had, and pinned her hair back with the 3 pins she'd been carrying in her coat pocket for a week. Then she picked up the metal box. "All right," she said to no one, or perhaps to all 12 of the women whose words lived in that box. "Let's go be believed." Judge Aldous Prine was a narrow man in his late 60s with spectacles worn low on a blade of a nose and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades listening to people lie to him and had developed, as a consequence, an almost preternatural patience. His office smelled of paper and pipe smoke. He had a habit of pressing his fingertips together when he was thinking that made him look like he was conducting invisible music. He did not look up immediately when Evelyn and Garrett were shown in by a young clerk who'd been told to expect them. Garrett had sent a note ahead from the hotel, a brief and careful one. When Prine did look up, his eyes moved first to Garrett, then to Evelyn, then to the metal box she carried, and then back to her face, and the sequence of it told Evelyn that he was a man who noticed what mattered. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "sit down." They sat. The clerk left and closed the door. "I've heard your name before," Prine said, without preamble. "From Benton County. The version I heard was that you were unstable and vindictive and had made repeated false accusations against your husband before abandoning your marriage." "I'm sure that is the version that traveled," Evelyn said. "Is it accurate?" "No." "Tell me the accurate version." So she did. She told it the same way she'd been building it for 18 months. Not with emotion, not with performance, but with sequence and specificity and the flat precision of someone who had gone over the facts so many times that they had become architecture. What Harlan had done. When? To whom? How she had discovered it. What had happened when he found out she knew. When she got to the night of the fire, she stopped for exactly 3 seconds, then continued. Prine listened without interrupting. His fingertips pressed together and moved apart, and pressed together again. When she finished, the office was quiet for a long moment. "The letters," he said. Evelyn set the metal box on his desk, produced a small key from around her neck where she'd been wearing it on a cord, and unlocked it. She had not opened the box in front of another person before. The 12 letters were inside, each folded and sealed in its own envelope, each with the writer's name on the front in her own handwriting. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, were 2 additional documents, an affidavit from a Benton County land clerk named Aldridge, who had witnessed Harlan forge a signature on a property deed, and a copy of a financial record that Evelyn had removed from Harlan's office during one of the last nights she'd spent in his house, showing a payment made to the county sheriff at the time of her attempted murder. Prine examined each item carefully, reading with the slow thoroughness of a man who understood that speed at this stage was its own kind of carelessness. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap and did not speak. Garrett sat beside her and also did not speak, which she had come to understand was one of his most valuable qualities. Finally, Prine set the last document down and removed his spectacles. "This payment record," he said. You removed this from your husband's house. Yes.
He will argue it was taken without right. He may argue that, Evelyn said. The document still says what it says.
Prine looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Mercer, I want to be honest with you about something because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort. He set his spectacles on the desk. The letters are compelling. The affidavit from Aldridge is useful. The payment record is significant. But Harlan Mercer is a man with considerable resources and considerable friends, including 2 men on the territorial legislature. If we move against him, it will need to be clean. It will need to be irrefutable. And you should prepare yourself for the reality that he will attack your credibility with everything he has, which is considerable. Evelyn met his gaze. I know that. And you want to proceed. I have been preparing to proceed for 18 months, she said. I did not carry those letters over a mountain range in October to be talked out of it in an office. Something in Prine's expression shifted. It was subtle, the very slight adjustment of a man recalibrating his assessment of who he was talking to. No, he said. I don't suppose you did. He replaced his spectacles. I'll have a warrant drawn up by morning. I'll send deputies to Benton County to execute the arrest before word can travel ahead of them. He looked at the letters still arranged on his desk. And I will need the letter writers, Mrs. Mercer, as many as are willing to testify in person. Evelyn's throat tightened slightly. This was the part she had known was coming and had been dreading not for herself but for them. Clara Beach. The others. Women who had written to her in secret, in the small hours of their own frightened nights. Women who had trusted her with their worst memories without any promise of what she would do with them. I'll send word, she said, but I cannot promise how many will come. I understand, Prine said. Whatever comes, we work with what we have. He stood, which was the signal that the meeting was ending, and extended his hand across the desk, not to Garrett, but to Evelyn. She shook it. The trial began 11 days later. Harlan Mercer was arrested at his home in Benton County on a Tuesday morning by 3 deputies and a territorial marshal before his lawyer could be reached. Evelyn knew this because Prine told her, and because the look on the face of Harlan's legal counsel, a sleek man named Foss, who arrived at the courthouse looking like he'd been dressed by someone who charged too much, told her that the speed of the arrest had rattled them. She saw Harlan for the first time in 18 months when the bailiff brought him into the courtroom. He looked the same. That was the first thing she registered, and it cost her something. The irrational part of her had wanted him to look diminished, undone. And instead he looked exactly as he had always looked, composed, well-dressed, with the particular brand of confident authority that came from decades of never facing consequences. His eyes found her across the courtroom, and he held her gaze for a moment, and what she saw there was not fear or shame, it was contempt. She held his gaze without blinking until he looked away. Foss opened the defense with the full force of what Harlan's resources could buy. A meticulous attack on Evelyn's character, her mental stability, her motives. He used words like obsession and delusion and vindictive fixation with the smooth confidence of a man who had used them before and found them effective. He described the letters as a coordinated conspiracy by a woman scorned to destroy an innocent man's reputation. He called Evelyn's 18 months of travel a campaign of defamation. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table and did not react. She had heard all of it before, in various forms, from various people. It had been said to her face and behind her back, and by people who should have known better. She had stopped flinching at it around the 14th month. When it was her turn, she took the stand and told her story in the same deliberate, architectural way she had told it to Prine. Foss cross-examined her for 2 hours, circling, probing, looking for the place where her composure would crack. He asked about her drinking habits, her relationships prior to Harlan, her behavior during the marriage. He asked, with exquisite cruelty, whether the fire had perhaps affected not just her face but her memory and her judgment. My memory is excellent, Evelyn said. My judgment is what got me out of a locked room. A sound moved through the courtroom gallery. Not quite a reaction, something more like a held breath releasing. Foss moved on. The letters were entered into evidence on the 3rd day. Prine read portions of each one into the record himself, in his quiet, precise voice, and the courtroom grew progressively more still as he read. Not the polite, attentive stillness of people watching a legal proceeding, but something heavier than that. The stillness of people absorbing something they can't unhear. And then Clara Beach walked in. Evelyn had not known she was coming. She had sent word, as she'd promised Prine, to all 12 women, with no pressure and no expectation attached. Just the date, the location, and the simple statement that she would be there. She had not let herself hope for response. Clara Beach was in her early 40s, dressed plainly, with the careful posture of a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She sat in the gallery for the first hour without being called. Then, during a recess, she appeared at Evelyn's side. "I'm here," she said. That was all. Evelyn looked at her. Clara's eyes were steady, though her hands were not. "You don't have to," Evelyn said. "I know." Clara straightened her shoulders slightly. "I'm here anyway." Clara testified on the 4th day. She spoke quietly and clearly about the land fraud, about her father, about the years of aftermath. Foss tried to dismantle her and found less purchase than he'd expected. Clara had a quality of unembellished precision that was difficult to attack without looking monstrous. She had barely stepped down from the stand when the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman Evelyn didn't immediately recognize entered, spoke briefly to the clerk, and was directed to the plaintiff's side of the room. Then another, and another. By the end of the 4th day's session, 6 of the 12 letter writers had arrived in Harmon City. 2 more came on the morning of the 5th day. They had traveled, some of them long distances, by themselves, at cost to themselves that Evelyn could only estimate. Not because anyone had compelled them, but because something had shifted. Something about the fact that it was actually happening, that a courtroom actually existed, that someone was actually listening, had moved them from the privacy of their fear into the difficult, necessary public of testimony. Evelyn watched them come, each one, and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. It was not triumph. It was something older and quieter than that. The feeling of a debt being paid not to her, but through her, to every woman who had ever been told her experience was not real enough to count. On the 5th day, Harlan's composure finally began to show its seams. It happened during the testimony of a woman named Ruth Palliser, who had worked as a bookkeeper for Harlan's land brokerage 7 years ago, and who described, with maddening specificity, a set of accounts she had been instructed to falsify and what had happened when she refused. She named figures, named dates, named the specific account codes. She had kept copies. She produced them. Foss objected. Prine overruled. Foss objected again, on different grounds, with a slightly raised voice that was the first crack in his own composure. Prine overruled again, with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and knew it. In the dock, Harlan's jaw tightened. It was a small thing, almost nothing. But Evelyn, who had spent 15 years learning to read the small signals of that face, saw it clearly. He was afraid. After 15 years of being the target of that face's contempt, after 18 months of running from what that face had decided about her, after everything that face represented, she saw it become afraid, and it felt not like victory but like something finally being true. Ruth Palliser stepped down. The courtroom was very quiet. Prine called a recess until morning, till, in the corridor outside, Evelyn stood against the wall with the empty metal box in her hands. Its contents, now in evidence, entered into the record, existing in a form that could not be taken back, and tried to locate something steady inside herself. Garrett appeared beside her. He had been in the gallery every day, saying nothing, simply present, the way a fixed point is present. 8 women, he said quietly. 8 women, she agreed. How are you holding up? She considered this honestly. I'm very tired, she said, and I think I might be holding up better than I expected. He nodded. He looked at the empty box in her hands. You've been carrying that since before I met you, he said. She looked down at it. The battered metal surface, the dent in the left corner from when she'd dropped it running through the dark of Garrett's barn, the small rust bloom near the hinge. It's lighter now, she said. She said it plainly, without dramatics. But something in her voice caught on the words, on the truth of them, and for a moment, just a moment, she pressed her lips together hard. Garrett said nothing. He did not reach for her hand or put a hand on her shoulder, did not fill the moment with anything it didn't need. He simply stood beside her in the corridor while the sounds of the courthouse moved around them, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. The verdict came on the morning of the 6th day. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. When they filed back in, Evelyn watched their faces the way she had watched everything in this courtroom.
with the careful, trained attention of someone who had learned that truth lives in small signals, in the angle of a jaw or the steadiness of an eye. She found what she was looking for before the foreman spoke. Guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of coercion, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit violence against a spouse, guilty. The word landed in the courtroom 3 times, clean and irrevocable, like nails being driven. Harlan Mercer said nothing. His composure had closed back around him like a coat, but it no longer fit the same way. Foss was already leaning toward him, speaking in a rapid undertone, but Harlan was looking across the room, at Evelyn. She looked back at him. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel the release she had imagined during all those cold nights of running that this moment would bring. What she felt was simpler and stranger than that. She felt herself stop holding her breath. A breath she had been holding for longer than 18 months, for years, for the entire long span of a marriage to someone who had decided early and completely that she did not matter. She let it out. Clara Beach was 3 seats to her left, and when Evelyn turned, Clara was looking at her with something in her eyes that was not quite tears and not quite a smile and was entirely its own thing. Evelyn reached out and took Clara's hand. Clara held it hard. Behind them, in the gallery, the other women sat with their own private versions of that same complex stillness. The stillness of people who have been waiting a very long time for a single true thing to be said in a room that was built, officially, for the saying of true things. It had been said. Harlan Mercer was led out of the courtroom by the bailiff. For the first time in 18 months, Evelyn Mercer did not watch the door. The celebration, such as it was, lasted exactly 1 evening. Mrs. Alcott at the hotel had brought up a bottle of decent whiskey without being asked, setting it on the small table in the common room off the lobby with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that some moments required acknowledgement without ceremony. Evelyn and Garrett and Clara Beach and 3 of the other women who had testified sat around that table as the last light left the Harmon City sky, and they talked. Not about the trial, not about what came next, but about ordinary things. About the weather coming in. About Clara's sister's new baby. About the quality of the hotel's biscuits, which were exceptional, and which Mrs. Alcott accepted credit for with dignified modesty. It was the most normal hour Evelyn had spent in longer than she could accurately calculate. She sat with her hands around a glass of whiskey she was only partially drinking and listened to the sound of women talking about ordinary things after having done an extraordinary one, and allowed herself, briefly and carefully, to feel something close to peace. Garrett sat across the table from her and mostly listened, the way he did, contributing a quiet word here and there. Sometime around 9 in the evening, his eyes met hers across the table, and what passed between them in that glance was wordless and unhurried. A simple acknowledgement that they were both here, that here was better than the alternatives, and that some things didn't need to be said to be real. She looked away first, but she was almost smiling when she did. The news arrived the next morning before breakfast. A young deputy named Cale Marsh, who had been assigned by Judge Prine to keep a general watch on matters relating to the Mercer case, knocked on the hotel room door at just past 6 in the morning, and the expression on his face when Evelyn opened it told her immediately that the evening of ordinary things was over. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "there's been a fire. Garrett's ranch was ash by the time word reached them in Harmon City. Not partially damaged, not salvageable in some form. Ash. The house, the barn, the fence lines, the small outbuilding where Garrett stored his winter equipment. Whoever had done it had been thorough. A neighboring rancher named Olds, who'd ridden out to investigate the smoke, found nothing standing above knee height and no animals left in the ruins, which meant they'd been driven off beforehand, which meant this was not accident or carelessness. This was message. Evelyn stood in the hotel room after Marsh had delivered this information and looked at the wall for a long moment. Garrett sat down on the edge of the bed. She watched him absorb it. 30 years of work, 2 years building the original house with his own hands, a decade of careful improvement, a wife's garden that had long since gone to weeds, but whose stone border he had never removed. She watched him absorb all of that being gone, and he did it with the same stillness he'd carried through the entire journey, except that this stillness was different, heavier. The stillness of something being held down rather than something naturally at rest. "Garrett," she said.
I'm all right, he said. I know you are. That isn't what I was going to say. He looked up. I'm sorry, she said. I knew it was possible, what they might do. I should have said so more clearly before you... Evelyn? His voice was quiet but certain. I knew exactly what I was riding into. I'm a grown man who made a grown man's choice. He held her gaze. Oh, don't carry that. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded, once, and moved on, because standing still in grief was a luxury neither of them could afford yet. The bounty, she said, turning to Cale Marsh, who was still standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. You said there's a bounty. Yes, ma'am. Word came in through channels this morning, $500. Marsh was young, maybe 24, with the look of someone who had chosen this work because he believed in it rather than because it paid well, which meant he was either very principled or very naive, and Evelyn hadn't yet determined which. Posted anonymously, but the sourcing points back to associates of the Mercer family. His brother-in-law, most likely, man named Cord Pelly. He runs a freighting operation out of Benton County, had significant financial ties to Harlan's land brokerage. And Pelly is who's funding the continued pursuit, Evelyn said. We believe so. He has the resources and the motivation. Harlan's conviction puts Pelly's own business dealings in a very uncomfortable light. Marsh hesitated. There's something else. Tell me. Marsh looked briefly at the floor, then back up. There's a federal land grant that Harlan brokered 8 years ago, large parcel, Eastern Territory. We're now finding evidence that several prominent men had a financial stake in that grant through Harlan, including 2 county commissioners and the former territorial land secretary. He paused. If those connections are fully exposed, it isn't just Harlan who faces consequences. It's an entire network. The room was very quiet. That's why they're not stopping, Garrett said. Yes, sir. Marsh turned the hat in his hands. Harlan's conviction was the first stone, but the men behind him, they're still free, and they're scared, and scared men with money are considerably more dangerous than confident ones. Evelyn walked to the window and looked out at the main street of Harmon City, already moving with the business of a regular morning. A freight wagon, 2 riders, a woman sweeping a storefront porch. A world proceeding with its ordinary rhythms, indifferent to the machinery working underneath it, $500 on her head. Garrett's life's work in ashes. A network of powerful men who had decided that their survival required her silence. She turned from the window. Deputy Marsh, she said, how much do you know about Cord Pelly's operation? He blinked. Quite a bit, actually. We've had eyes on his freighting business for about 2 years. There are discrepancies in his manifest records that suggest he's been moving more than freight. And the commissioners? The land secretary? Names, approximate financial connections, some documentation. Nothing yet that would hold in court the way the Mercer evidence did. But it's a foundation. Yes, ma'am, it's a foundation. Evelyn looked at Garrett. He was watching her with that steady attention she'd come to understand. Not passive, not deferring, but fully present, waiting to see what she would decide and prepared to move when she did. We're not running, she said. Garrett's expression didn't change, but something in it settled, the way a door settles when it's properly closed. No, he agreed. We're not. Deputy Marsh, Evelyn picked up her coat from the chair. Take us to Judge Prine. Prine listened to Marsh's account of the overnight developments with the same unflappable patience he demonstrated throughout the trial, though Evelyn noticed that the space between his pressed fingertips had narrowed. When Marsh finished, the judge was quiet for a long moment. The land grant document, he said finally. Do we have the original or copies? Copies, Marsh said. The original is filed with the Territorial Land Office. Which means it's a public record, Evelyn said. Prine looked at her. Which means it cannot be destroyed without destroying a public record. Yes, that is correct. He removed his spectacles and set them on his desk with precision. Mrs. Mercer, what you're describing, a full exposure of everyone connected to Harlan Mercer's network, is a considerably larger undertaking than the case we just concluded. The case against Harlan was 18 months of preparation and 12 corroborating witnesses. What you're proposing now involves men with significantly more legal resources and political insulation. I know, she said. The risk to you personally, given the bounty, I know that too. Prine looked at her steadily. Then why? Evelyn sat forward in the chair. Because Ruth Palliser told me something during the trial. She said she knew about 3 other women, not letter writers, not witnesses, women who were still living inside situations they couldn't get out of because the men controlling those situations were connected to Harlan's network. As long as that network functions, those women have nowhere to go. She paused. The conviction was necessary, but it isn't sufficient. Not if the structure that protected Harlan just reorganizes itself around new leadership. Prine looked at Garrett. Mr. Boone, your ranch was destroyed last night. That's correct. And you're sitting in this office at 7 in the morning supporting what Mrs. Mercer is proposing. I'm here, Garrett said simply. I think that answers the question.
Prine pressed his fingertips together, pulled them apart. All right, he said. Here's what I can do. I can issue protective orders that give Deputy Marsh the authority to act on evidence related to the Pelly connection and the land grant. I can request federal involvement, which will take time but will add considerably to the weight of any eventual charges. He looked at Evelyn. What I cannot do is protect you from the bounty with a piece of paper. A bounty that size will bring people who do not respect paper. Then we move quickly, Evelyn said. We move carefully, Prine corrected. Quickly and carefully are not opposites, but they require deliberate balance. He reached for a ledger on his desk. I'll need a week to get the proper documentation in order. During that week, I would strongly suggest you not be in Harmon City. Where would you suggest? Garrett asked. Prine looked up. Somewhere no one would think to look for a 51-year-old woman who just won a high-profile conviction. A dry pause. Perhaps the last place anyone would expect her to go. 3 days later, Evelyn Mercer rode back into Benton County. The town of Sallow Creek was the kind of place that remembered everything and forgave nothing, which was precisely why returning to it required more from her than anything the mountain passage or the courtroom had demanded. The mountains had required her body. The courtroom had required her composure. Sallow Creek required her to walk back into the specific architecture of her own humiliation and stand in it without flinching. She knew this place in the grain. She had lived here for 15 years. She had walked every plank of its boardwalks and known every face in its church, and smiled at every civic dinner where Harlan had shone, and she had been, increasingly, a piece of furniture he'd stopped noticing. The whispers started within 20 minutes of her arrival. She could feel them without hearing them. The particular atmospheric shift that happens in a small town when something unexpected appears and the social machinery begins processing it. Heads turned on the main street. A woman in the dry goods store doorway stopped and stared openly. 2 men near the livery exchanged a glance that had an entire conversation compressed into it. Garrett rode beside her and said nothing. Deputy Marsh, who had ridden with them along with a second deputy named Fay, kept his eyes forward in the professional manner of someone who understood that the situation required presence without provocation. They were heading for the Sallow Creek Sheriff's Office. Not because Evelyn trusted the current sheriff, a man named Tull, who had been aggressively absent during the trial, and whose financial records, Marsh had informed her quietly, showed a very interesting series of deposits over the past 4 years. But because walking through the front door of the official law enforcement of the town where she'd been discredited was itself a statement. She needed people to see her walk through that door. Sheriff Tull was behind his desk when they entered, and the color that left his face when he saw Evelyn told her everything she needed to know about the state of his conscience. He was a broad man who had run to softness in his 50s, with a mustache that he clearly believed added authority to his face, and that didn't. He stood up too quickly when they entered, knocking a coffee cup, and then seemed angry at himself for the reaction. Mrs. Mercer, he said, and managed to make her name sound like an accusation. Sheriff Tull, she said pleasantly, I'm here as a courtesy to inform you that Deputy Cale Marsh, operating under authority granted by Judge Aldous Prine of the Territorial Court, will be conducting an investigation into certain financial transactions connected to the Mercer land fraud case. That investigation will include records and individuals based in Benton County. She paused. I wanted to tell you personally, since you'll be hearing about it one way or another. Tull looked at Marsh. Marsh produced the documentation from his coat. Tull took it, looked at it, and his mustache did something complicated. This is a broad authority, he said. Yes, Marsh agreed. It is. I'll want to consult with... You're welcome to consult with anyone you like, Evelyn said. That's your right. She held his gaze. While you're consulting, the investigation will proceed. She turned and walked back out. On the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, she stopped for a moment and looked at the street. The same street, the same storefronts, the same distant sound of the smithy, the same particular quality of light that Benton County had in the late afternoon. A place she had thought she would never come back to, and yet here she was, standing in it with her spine straight and her scarred face turned toward whatever came next. Clara Beach was waiting at the end of the block, as they'd arranged. She had come back to Sallow Creek the day before, quietly, and had spent those 24 hours doing what Evelyn had asked, visiting certain women, delivering certain messages, gauging the temperature of certain situations. "Well?" Evelyn asked when they reached her. Clara looked at her steadily. "3 women want to talk to you. 2 more are considering it. There's also a bookkeeper at the Pelly Freight Office who has been waiting for someone to ask the right question for approximately 2 years. "The bookkeeper," Evelyn said. "Her name is Doris Ames. She's 63 years old. She's been with Pelly's operation for 11 years, and she apparently has a memory for figures that borders on the supernatural." Clara paused. "She also, I'm told, has been quietly making personal copies of certain ledger entries for the past 8 years. Garrett, standing beside Evelyn, made a sound that was close to a laugh. "She's been waiting," Evelyn said. "She's been waiting," Clara confirmed. She just needed to know someone was coming who wouldn't disappear. Doris Ames lived in a small house 2 streets off the main road that she kept with the precision of someone who believed order was a form of dignity. She answered the door before they knocked, which meant she'd been watching, and she looked at Evelyn for a long moment before stepping back to let them in. She was exactly as Clara had described, compact, white-haired, with eyes that moved over things with the quick, cataloging attention of someone who had spent a professional lifetime noticing what numbers didn't add up. She served them tea she'd already had ready, which confirmed the watching, and she sat across from Evelyn at her kitchen table with her hands folded and her chin level. "You won in Harmon City," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Evelyn said. "And now you're here for Pelly, and the commissioners and the land secretary and anyone else whose name is in the records." Doris looked at her for a moment. "I want you to understand something, Mrs. Mercer. I'm not a brave woman. I am a woman who has spent 8 years watching what I believed was wrong, continue unchallenged, and who made copies of documents because she didn't know what else to do with the knowledge and couldn't live with doing nothing." She paused. "I'm not brave. I'm just very tired of being complicit by silence." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "In my experience," she said, "that is exactly what brave feels like from the inside." Something shifted in Doris's expression. She reached under the table and produced a locked metal box, smaller than Evelyn's had been, but the same essential thing, and set it on the table. 8 years of quarterly ledgers, she said, cross-referenced with the federal land grant documentation. Cord Pelly has been using his freighting manifest to launder money from fraudulent land transactions, using dummy accounts, I can show you the structure, and distributing the proceeds to a roster of 17 individuals. She opened the box. "I have names, amounts, and dates for all 17. The kitchen was very quiet. Garrett leaned forward slightly. Marsh was already reaching for his notebook. Evelyn looked at the contents of the box, neatly organized, rubber-banded, labeled in a small, precise handwriting, and felt something she recognized from the courtroom, the weight of accumulated truth, finally in the right room. "Doris," she said, "would you be willing to testify?" The older woman looked at her box of documents, then at Evelyn. "I've been willing for 8 years," she said. "I just didn't have anywhere to go." What followed was neither clean nor quick, but it was relentless. Marsh sent the ledger copies to Prine by secure courier the following morning. Prine's response, a terse message that contained the word extraordinary twice, which Marsh said was the judge's equivalent of a standing ovation, came back within 48 hours, along with expanded authorization and a request for federal marshals that had been, it seemed, already in motion. The 3 women Clara had identified came forward one by one over the following 4 days. None of them were letter writers. None of them had been part of Evelyn's original case. They were women who existed in the wider orbit of Harlan's network, adjacent to Pelly's operation, or to the commissioners, or simply to the general culture of intimidation that the network had sustained over years. They told their stories to Marsh in Doris Ames's kitchen, with Evelyn present not as interrogator, but as anchor.
a visible proof that coming forward did not end in disappearance or punishment. The bounty was still active. Evelyn was aware of it at all times, in the way you're aware of a sound at the edge of hearing, not paralyzing, but requiring constant peripheral attention. Garrett had taken on a quiet but systematic role in managing this, coordinating with Marsh's second deputy, Faye, to monitor who was coming into town and from where, establishing a system of early warning that drew on the network of people in Sallow Creek who had decided, for various reasons, that they were done looking the other way. Because that was happening too. Quietly, unevenly, the way social change always happens. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in dozens of small ones, each almost invisible on its own. A man who had been Harlan's friend for 20 years telling his wife over dinner that he had known something was wrong and hadn't spoken, and being unable to meet her eyes. A shopkeeper who had refused to serve Evelyn 6 years ago appearing at Doris Ames's door to ask haltingly what he could do. The mayor of Sallow Creek, a former ally of Harlan's who had spent the weeks since the conviction trying to calculate which direction the wind was now blowing, requesting a meeting with Marsh that lasted 3 hours and ended with the mayor's name on a cooperation agreement. The town was not transformed. It was not redeemed. Transformation took longer than days, and redemption was a transaction between individuals and their own histories, not something that could be arranged from the outside. But it was shifting. Cracking in the places where the wait had been too long concentrated. Cord Pelly was arrested on a Thursday by federal marshals who arrived from the territorial capital with an authority that even his lawyer couldn't maneuver around. He came out of his freight office looking surprised, which was interesting. Evelyn, watching from across the street, noted that he had apparently believed, right up until the moment of the arrest, that his money and connections would function the way they always had. The expression on his face when they didn't was the expression of a man whose fundamental understanding of how the world worked had just been revised. She felt no satisfaction in it, just the steady, clear-eyed acknowledgement that something necessary was occurring. The first commissioner, a man named Bryce Aldmore, who had served Benton County in various official capacities for 25 years, turned himself in on a Saturday morning, accompanied by his attorney, having apparently concluded that cooperation was preferable to the federal marshals arriving at his house. His cooperation produced 3 additional names, which produced their own subsequent unravelings, the whole thing running like a thread pulled from the edge of a garment. The second commissioner tried to run. He made it as far as a relay station 40 miles north before Faye, who had been quietly excellent throughout this entire operation, caught up with him with a federal warrant and the particular lack of sympathy that competent deputies develop when they've been kept busy by someone else's greed. The former territorial land secretary, a man named Holt, who had retired 2 years ago to a very comfortable house that was now considerably easier to understand, was the last. His arrest took place on a Tuesday afternoon, and with it, the 17 names in Doris Ames's ledgers were complete. Evelyn sat in Doris's kitchen that evening, and Doris made tea, and they sat across from each other in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The kitchen windows were dark with October night. A lamp burned on the table between them. "Is it over?" Doris asked. Evelyn considered this honestly. "This part of it," she said. Doris nodded slowly. "That's an honest answer." "It's the only kind I have." They drank their tea. "What will you do now?" Doris asked. Evelyn looked at the lamp for a moment. The question had been presenting itself to her in various forms for several days. In the quiet moments between one crisis and the next, in the early mornings when she woke before the light and lay in whatever borrowed room she was occupying and heard, in the absence of immediate urgency, the question of what came after. She was 51 years old. She had been surviving for so long that she had not allowed herself to think in terms of living, and living, she was discovering, required a different kind of planning. "I'm not entirely sure," she said, "but I'm starting to think that's all right." Doris looked at her with the quiet assessment of a woman who had spent 8 years watching and waiting. "You've done something extraordinary, Mrs. Mercer." "We've done something," Evelyn said. "Clara, Ruth, the others. You." She met Doris's eyes. "I was just the one carrying the box." Doris made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "Someone had to carry it." "Someone had to carry it," Evelyn agreed. She found Garrett later that evening, sitting on the steps outside the boarding house where they'd both been staying, looking up at the sky with his hat on his knee. It had cleared after a week of cloud, and the stars over Benton County were the same stars they'd watched from the ridge in the mountains, indifferent and magnificent and entirely unconcerned with the business of human justice. She sat down beside him. For a while, neither of them said anything. The street was quiet, the particular quiet of a frontier town after 10, when the saloons were still lit, but everything else had gone to its rest. "Garrett," she said. I owe you a ranch." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't owe me anything." "I'm not speaking in terms of debt," she said. "I'm speaking in terms of what I intend to do about the situation." She looked at the street. "I have no money. I have no property. I have a metal box that is now empty and a reputation that is in the process of revision." A pause. "But I have time, and I have some capabilities, and I am not inclined toward the idea of doing nothing when there is something to be done." Garrett turned to look at her. "What are you proposing?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Something. With you." She said the last part plainly, without ornament, because she was 51 years old and had lost too much time to imprecision. "If that's a thing you'd be open to." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences they'd shared. It was the silence of something being decided. Garrett looked at her face in the lamplight spilling from the boarding house window, the strong jaw and the dark eyes and the scar that she'd learned somewhere between the mountains and the courtroom to carry not as damage but as history. "I've been open to it since about the second day in the ravine," he said. "I was waiting to see if you'd get there." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "You could have said something," she said. "You had a few other things going on," he said mildly. A sound escaped her. Not quite a laugh, but its close neighbor, the first easy, unguarded sound she could remember making in a very long time. It surprised her. She could feel it in her chest, bright and slightly aching, like a window opened in a room that had been shut too long. Garrett was almost smiling. Almost. She looked back at the street. The stars. The ordinary, quiet darkness of a town in the process of becoming something slightly different than what it had been. "All right then," she said. "All right," he agreed. Above them, the sky was enormous and indifferent and full of light that had traveled unimaginable distances to reach this specific patch of frontier night. Somewhere in the territorial capital, men were sorting through ledgers and preparing cases and writing the administrative language of consequence. Somewhere in the network Clara had been quietly helping build, a woman in a difficult situation was learning that there was a path out. Somewhere, the ongoing imperfect machinery of accountability was doing its slow and necessary work. And here, on the steps of a boarding house in Sallow Creek, Evelyn Mercer sat beside a man who had ridden blind through a frozen ravine for her without being asked, and let herself think for the first time in a long time about what the future looked like. It did not look like what she had lost. It looked like something she hadn't had before, something that didn't have a name yet, which was fine. She had learned, over 51 years of living, that the best things rarely arrived already named. They arrived first. The naming came later, after you'd had time to understand what you were looking at. She was not afraid of that. She had survived worse than the unknown. She could survive the beginning of something good. The bounty didn't disappear with Cord Pelly's arrest. That was the thing about money already released into the world. It kept moving, kept finding new hands, kept motivating new calculations, regardless of whether the man who'd originally posted it was now sitting in a territorial holding cell waiting for his own trial date. $500 was a significant sum in any economy, and there were men in the frontier territories who made their entire living pursuing significant sums without asking too many questions about the source. Evelyn understood this. She had understood it from the moment Marsh told her about the bounty, and she had factored it into every decision she'd made since. The difference now was that the network of people watching for trouble, the early warning system Garrett and Faye had quietly built over the weeks in Sallow Creek, had grown considerably. It now included the mayor's office, 3 business owners, the telegraph operator, and a woman named Ida Graves who ran the boarding house 2 streets from Doris Ames, and who had, apparently, been observing the movements of strangers in Sallow Creek with extraordinary precision for the better part of a decade, simply because she found people interesting. It was Ida who brought word on a gray Wednesday morning, appearing at the door of the room Evelyn shared with Clara with the brisk efficiency of a woman delivering important correspondence. 2 men rode in last night, she said, without preamble, because she had quickly determined that Evelyn preferred information delivered cleanly. Stayed at Harnet's place on the South Road. Not freighters, not ranch hands. The way they came in, separately, an hour apart, met up in the stable afterward. That's not travelers, that's coordination. Evelyn was already pulling on her boots. Did you get a look at them?
Good enough. Ida described them with the kind of precise visual memory that most people reserved for faces they feared. One was large, fair-haired, with a scar across his left hand. The other was leaner, dark, carried himself like someone who'd had military training at some point and hadn't let it go. Professional, Ida concluded. That's my read. That's my read too, Evelyn said. She sent Clara to find Marsh and sent word to Garrett through the network, then sat down at the small desk in the room and thought carefully for approximately 4 minutes. She was not afraid exactly. Fear had been her constant companion for long enough that she had developed a working relationship with it. She knew how to use it as information rather than letting it use her as a destination. What she felt now was the cold, focused clarity of someone who understood that the final shape of a thing is determined in its last moments as much as in its first. She was not going to disappear. She was not going to change her patterns in ways that would signal panic to anyone watching, and she was not going to wait for them to choose the terms of whatever came next. When Marsh arrived, she told him what she wanted to do. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a considerable risk, he said. So is everything else, she said. And here we are. Marsh glanced at Garrett, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and who offered the slight, deliberate nod of a man who had learned when to defer and when to hold. All right, Marsh said, but we do it my way on the logistics. Agreed, Evelyn said. Your logistics. My presence. The plan was straightforward in concept and required considerable precision in execution. Evelyn would be visible, deliberately, specifically visible, at the Sallow Creek Town Hall meeting that had been scheduled for that Thursday evening. The meeting itself was legitimate. It concerned the formal appointment of an interim commissioner to replace Aldmore, whose cooperation agreement had required his resignation. Half the town would be there. It was exactly the kind of public setting where men operating on a bounty would be reluctant to move, because witnesses were expensive complications, but also exactly the kind of setting where, if Marsh positioned things correctly, they could be identified and contained before they made any move at all. Fay stationed himself near Harnet's stable before dawn. 2 additional deputies that Marsh had quietly requested from the territorial office arrived mid-morning on separate roads. Ida Graves agreed to watch the street approaches from the window of her boarding house with a small mirror arrangement she'd devised herself that allowed her to see both directions without being seen and to signal by lamplight to a deputy positioned at the corner. Garrett wanted to be inside the hall with Evelyn. I need you on the street, she said. Evelyn, Garrett. She met his eyes directly. You know this town better than any of the deputies. You know who belongs where, who's moved wrong, which face doesn't fit. That's worth more on the street than beside me in the hall. She held his gaze. I will be surrounded by half the population of Sallow Creek. I'll be safer inside than you'll be outside. He didn't like it. She could see that plainly, but he was, at his core, a man who evaluated situations honestly rather than emotionally, and he knew she was right. If anything moves wrong inside, he said, anything at all, Marsh will be 2 steps behind me the entire time, she said. I know. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, the same nod she'd come to know, the one that meant a decision had been made past the point of revisiting. You'd better come out of that hall, he said quietly. I intend to, she said. I have plans. Something moved through his expression, that almost smile, the one that had been appearing with greater frequency over the weeks, as though it was becoming more practiced, more at home on his face. He went to take his position on the street. The town hall meeting of Sallow Creek was more heavily attended than any civic gathering in recent memory, which Evelyn suspected had less to do with the pressing matter of interim commissioner appointment and considerably more to do with the fact that the entire town was aware, in the way that small towns are always aware, that something was happening. The air in the hall had the particular quality of a room full of people pretending to be engaged in ordinary business while actually paying attention to something else entirely. Evelyn sat in the 3rd row with Clara to her left and Marsh 2 seats behind her, and she kept her face forward and her hand still in her lap,
and let people look at her because looking was the point. She was here. Visibly, undeniably, unhidably here. The woman everyone had whispered about for 6 years, the woman they'd called unstable and vindictive and broken, sitting in the third row of her former town's civic meeting in the aftermath of having brought down one of their most respected citizens and 11 of his associates. Let them look. The meeting proceeded. The interim commissioner appointment was discussed with the slightly dazed quality of a community still recalibrating its understanding of its own power structures. The mayor, a different man than he'd been 6 weeks ago, not in his character but in his visible awareness of consequences, conducted the business with a careful neutrality that Evelyn found interesting. He had not become a good man. He had become a careful one. She would take it. She was aware of the doors, both of them, the main entrance at the back of the hall and the side door near the front that led to the street beside the dry goods store. She had mapped them on the way in, the way she'd learned to map exits in every room she entered, a habit built over 18 months of necessary vigilance. At 20 minutes into the meeting, the side door opened. The man who entered was the lean, dark one Ida had described. Military bearing, precise movements, eyes that moved across the room with the systematic assessment of someone counting and categorizing. He took a position near the side wall, not sitting, which was the wrong choice if he wanted to blend in. A man who arrives late to a civic meeting and doesn't sit is a man who is not there for the meeting. Evelyn did not turn her head. She felt Marsh shift behind her. 2 minutes later, Faye's distinctive double knock came from outside the main entrance, the agreed signal. The large fair-haired man was on the street then, which meant he'd seen Faye's position and was reconsidering his approach. Evelyn stood up. The mayor stopped mid-sentence. The hall went quiet in the particular way of a room that has just realized something is happening that isn't on the agenda. "I apologize for the interruption," Evelyn said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. She was not performing calm. She was calm, the deep, steady kind that comes from being past the point of doubt. "I have a brief statement I'd like to make, with the mayor's permission." The mayor looked at her, looked at the man standing near the side wall who had gone very still, looked back at Evelyn. He was not a stupid man, whatever else he was. He understood, in that moment, that something was being decided. "Go ahead, Mrs. Mercer," he said. She turned to face the room. All those faces. Some she recognized from 15 years of living in this county. Some she didn't. Some that had looked away from her at her worst moments, and some that had looked too long, and some that were seeing her clearly for the first time. "Many of you knew me as Harlan Mercer's wife," she said. "A number of you were told specific things about my character, my stability, and my motivations. I'm aware of what was said. I'm not here to argue any of it." She paused, letting the silence hold. "I'm here because this is my community too. Or it was, once, and I'm choosing to make it so again. And because the work that resulted in Harlan's conviction and in the subsequent arrests of the 11 men connected to his network is not finished. There are women in this county who are still in dangerous situations. There are financial injuries to families here that have not been addressed. And there are structures, ways that this community looks the other way, ways it decides whose word counts and whose doesn't, that a conviction can't dismantle by itself." The room was absolutely still. "I'm not asking for an apology," she continued. "I'm asking for participation, for people in this town who know things, who've seen things, who've stayed silent because they didn't believe silence had consequences, to reconsider that belief." She looked across the rows of faces. "Silence has consequences. I know that better than most. So does speaking. But speaking is at least a choice. Silence just lets other people make the choices for you." She sat down. The quiet lasted another 3 seconds. Then, from somewhere in the middle rows, someone started clapping. Then someone else. It was not a roar. It was the careful, genuine applause of people who were still deciding what they believed, which was, Evelyn thought, more honest than certainty. At the side wall, the lean, dark man had not moved. He was watching her with an expression that had shifted from assessment to something less professional. Behind Evelyn, Marsh rose quietly and moved toward him. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Marsh produced his badge and his authorization and spoke in a low voice that didn't carry to the hall. The man's eyes moved to the side door, to the main entrance, calculating,
and found apparently that the calculation didn't favor any of his options. Faye was outside. 2 territorial deputies were outside. And he was in a room full of witnesses. He went with Marsh without a scene. The fair-haired man on the street, upon seeing his partner emerge with the deputy's hand on his elbow, made a run for it that lasted approximately 40 yards before one of the territorial deputies caught him near the corner of the feed store in a manner that Ida Graves would later describe with evident satisfaction as extremely efficient. The bounty died that night, not with a formal notice, but with the practical reality that the men funding it were all in custody, and the 2 professionals who'd come to collect it were now in the Sallow Creek jail awaiting transport to the territorial facility in Harmon City. Word moves in certain channels, and in those channels, a dead bounty is a dead bounty regardless of whether anyone makes an announcement. Garrett was waiting on the hall steps when Evelyn came out. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and in that moment was everything. The ravine and the mountain pass, and the courtroom and the burned ranch and the kitchen tables, and the testimony and all the long cold miles of the journey that had ended here, on the steps of a town hall in Sallow Creek on a Thursday night with the stars coming out overhead. "Well," he said. "Well?" she agreed. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked down the steps together into the night. Winter came to Benton County in the 3rd week of November with the unhurried authority of something that had been preparing for months. The temperature dropped cleanly, and the first snow fell on a Sunday, covering the scorched ground where Garrett's ranch had stood in a white that made it look briefly like the ruins weren't there. They stood at the edge of what had been the front fence, the stone post still standing, because stone is stubborn about surviving, and looked at the snow-covered ground where a house had been. 30 years, Evelyn said. 31, Garrett said. I keep miscounting. She looked at him sideways. How are you? He considered this with his characteristic honesty. 31 years ago, I built something from raw ground, he said. I know how to do it. The first time I had to learn everything. This time, I only have to do it. A pause. That's different, not easier necessarily, but different. Evelyn looked at the ground. The snow was clean over the ash. Whatever had been destroyed underneath it was underneath it. And what was above was white and new and entirely blank. I want to build something here, she said. With you. The ranch, obviously, the house, the practical things. But also, she stopped, choosing words carefully. There are women who have nowhere to go when they need to leave. I know this because I was one of them. I know what it costs not having a place, not having someone who will help you carry things without asking too many questions first. She looked at him. I want this to be a place like that, where people can come when they need to. Garrett looked at this blank white ground for a long moment. You're talking about rebuilding the ranch and running a refuge operation simultaneously. I'm talking about the ranch being both things at once, she said. Integrated. Not a charity, not an institution, just a place that functions, that works, that is also available to people who need it to be. She paused. Clara said she'd come, help manage it. Ruth Palliser has skills that would be useful. Doris Ames has expressed interest in keeping the books. You've been planning this, Garrett said. I've had time to think while you were doing the heavy work, she said. He turned to look at her fully then, and what was in his expression was not surprise, but something that had moved past surprise into a steadier, warmer territory. I'll need to rebuild the barn first, he said. The house can wait a few weeks if we have the boarding house, but the barn needs to be functional before the worst of the winter hits, or we'll have nowhere to keep the stock we're going to need. Evelyn blinked. You're already planning the sequence. I've been planning the sequence since about 3 days after the trial, he said. I was waiting to see what you needed it to be before I finalized anything. She stared at him. You waited 6 weeks. I didn't want to presume. She made the sound that was a laugh's close neighbor, the one she'd first made on the boarding house steps, the one that still surprised her slightly every time it appeared, bright and aching and alive. Garrett, next time presume. Noted, he said, and this time the almost smile completed itself into the real thing, unhurried and genuine. The smile of a man who had decided some things and was at peace with the deciding. They stood together at the edge of what had been and looked at what would be, and the snow kept falling with the quiet indifference of weather,
covering everything equally, making no distinctions between ash and stone. The rebuilding took the better part of the winter and all of the early spring. The barn went up first, as Garrett had planned, with help from 3 neighboring ranchers who arrived one morning without being asked, bringing lumber and tools, and the unceremonious practicality of men who understood that neighbors were a form of infrastructure. Garrett worked alongside them without ceremony, and Evelyn fed them at midday with a competence in the ranch kitchen that surprised no one who knew her and apparently surprised several people who didn't. The house rose through February and March. Garrett's original house had been a single man's house, solid but compact, built for function. The new one was larger, designed with deliberate thought for the dual purpose Evelyn had described in the snow. There was a main living space that was genuinely communal. There were 3 additional rooms beyond the master bedroom. There was a small office, Doris Ames's domain, when she came, which she did in April, arriving with 2 trunks and a locked box of accounting materials, and the air of a woman who had waited long enough for something worth organizing. Clara Beach arrived in late March, which was earlier than anyone had anticipated, and immediately proved indispensable in ways that went beyond any specific task. She had a quality that Evelyn recognized because she'd needed it herself. The quality of making people feel that they had been seen without being scrutinized, that their presence was welcome without being conditional. The first woman who came to the ranch needing a place to be stayed 3 weeks and left with a plan and a small amount of money from a fund that Clara had already organized with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been thinking about logistics before the logistics were required. Ruth Palliser came in the summer. She brought her particular gift for documentation, which turned out to be exactly what was needed when Deputy Cale Marsh, promoted now, carrying more responsibility with the same earnest conviction that had made Evelyn trust him early, began coordinating with the ranch on matters that required precise records. The arrangement was unofficial but functional, a way station, an information point, a place where certain things could be said and certain people could be helped in the gap between what the law could formally do and what people actually needed. Faye, who turned out to be a woman that Evelyn had initially, and she admitted this privately with some embarrassment, assumed was a man's nickname, came by occasionally with updates that she delivered in her direct economical way, and then stayed for dinner because Evelyn had decided early that anyone who showed up at the ranch at dinner time was eating dinner. The trial of Cord Pelly and his associated co-defendants concluded in April. The federal involvement that Prine had requested proved to be both slower and more thorough than the original case. Slower because federal machinery moved at federal pace. More thorough because federal authority reached into corners that territorial jurisdiction couldn't. The 17 names in Doris Ames's ledgers became 19 when 2 additional connections surfaced during the federal review. All 19 were convicted on various charges, the sentences ranging from substantial fines and removal from office to prison terms that reflected the gravity of what they'd participated in and protected. Harlan Mercer's appeal, filed with the efficiency of a man who had spent his life believing consequences were for other people, was denied in March by a panel of 3 judges, one of whom was Aldous Prine. The denial was written in Prine's precise, unadorned language, and took apart every argument Foss had constructed with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had read the Doris Ames ledgers and the 12 letters and the Aldridge affidavit, and had formed a view that was not subject to revision by clever lawyering. Harlan would serve 12 years. He would be 64 when he was released, and the empire he had built with 20 years of manipulation, fraud, and violence would no longer exist in any form he could return to. Evelyn received the news of the denied appeal on a Thursday afternoon in late March. She was in the new kitchen of the new house, making coffee that had finally become good again now that she was living somewhere with regular access to adequate supplies. She read the letter from Marsh twice, set it on the kitchen table, and stood at the window looking out at the range where 2 horses were moving in the early spring light. She waited for something to happen inside her, some shift, some weightlifting. What she felt was quieter than that. Not the dramatic release of a burden she'd expected, more like the slow awareness that a sound she'd stopped consciously hearing had finally ceased. A background frequency that had been running for so long she'd built her whole life around navigating it, gone now. The silence where it had been was strange at first, and then simply real, and then, gradually, something to inhabit rather than something to notice. She poured her coffee and took it to the porch and sat in the chair she'd put there in the second week of March, the one that faced east toward the open range, and watched the horses move in the early light. Garrett found her there 20 minutes later. He had been in the barn, which was where he was most mornings, working with the quiet purposefulness that was native to him and that she had stopped finding remarkable only because she'd grown so accustomed to it. He came up on the porch with his own cup and sat in the chair beside hers. She handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it, set it on the railing. 12 years, he said. 12 years, she confirmed. They sat with that for a while. How do you feel? He asked. She thought about it seriously, the way he'd taught her to, by his example, by the way he always waited for his own true answer before speaking. Finished, she said. Not done, not stopping. Finished with that part. Like a room I've been living in for a long time that I can now leave the door open on instead of standing guard over it. She paused. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. It makes perfect sense. The horses moved across the range in the early light, their breath clouding in the cold air. Somewhere behind the barn, a meadowlark was running through its repertoire with the cheerful persistence of a bird that did not recognize March as too early for that sort of thing. Garrett, she said. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly without being careful about my feelings, because I'm not fragile about this, and I'd rather know what's true. He looked at her steadily. All right. Are you happy? She said. Here. This. The way it is now. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the range. I'm going to answer your question, he said, but I'm going to do it by telling you something first. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. When my wife died, Margaret, there was a period of about 2 years where I genuinely believed that the life I was living was more or less complete. Not ended, not over, but complete in the sense of all the significant things having already happened. I was going to tend my ranch and grow old, and that was what remained. He paused. I didn't feel bad about that exactly. It just felt like fact. And now? She said. He looked at her. Now, I think I was wrong about what complete meant, he said. I thought it meant finished. I think it actually meant something more like ready. His voice was steady and clear, the voice of a man saying something he had known for some time and was only now finding the right moment to say. I'm not just happy here, Evelyn. I'm more alive than I've been in a decade. And I'm aware that the primary reason for that is sitting in the chair next to mine, asking me uncomfortable questions before the coffee's properly gone. Evelyn looked at him. The morning light was doing something generous to everything it touched. The range, the barn, the new house with its 3 extra rooms, and Doris Ames's accounting ledgers, and the quiet, ongoing life they were building inside it. That might be the longest sentence you've said to me at one time, she said. I've been saving it, he said. She reached over and took his hand. She did it plainly, without hesitation, the way she was learning to do things she wanted, directly, without the long internal negotiation that years of a bad marriage had made habitual. His hand closed around hers, warm despite the morning cold, with the deliberate gentleness of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding. They sat like that until the light changed and the coffee was gone, and the meadowlark finally decided it had sung enough for one morning. In June, when the last of the spring mud had dried and the range was beginning its summer green, Clara organized a gathering at the ranch. It was not formally announced as anything in particular. Clara's invitation, sent by letter to the women who had testified and those who had come forward afterward, and a few others who had been helped by what the ranch had quietly become, simply described an afternoon at the Boone place, a meal, an open door. The kind of language that let people decide what they were coming to and whether they wanted to come at all. 11 women came, Clara and Ruth and Doris, whom Evelyn had come to think of as her constants, the architecture of the daily life they'd built together. 3 of the original letter writers, 2 women who had come to the ranch in the winter, stayed their necessary time, and rebuilt enough of themselves to leave. A young woman named Petra, whom Marsh had quietly referred to them in March, who was only beginning to understand that what she'd been living inside was not her fault. And a woman who appeared at the gate that morning with no prior word sent. A woman Evelyn didn't recognize at first, older, heavy-set, who stood at the gate with her hat in her hands, looking at the house with an expression that mixed hope and terror in a ratio Evelyn understood precisely. She went out to the gate herself.
Are you Evelyn Mercer? The woman asked. I am, Evelyn said. My name is Frances Dodd, the woman said. I'm from Cayuga County. I heard, someone told me, that you were a person who believed women when they told you things. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Come in, she said. We're about to eat.
The afternoon unfolded with the particular warmth of a gathering that has no agenda beyond its own existence. Food on a long table brought outside into the June light. Children who had come with two of the women running in the yard with the gleeful purposefulness of children who have recently discovered space. The sound of voices talking over and alongside each other in the way that happens when people are comfortable. Evelyn moved through it, filling cups, making introductions, sitting for a while beside Frances Dodd while the woman ate and said very little and seemed to be slowly unwinding from some interior tension she'd been carrying for a long time. She sat beside Petra, who was quieter than she'd been in March, quieter in the good way of someone learning to think, rather than the frightened way of someone afraid to speak. She sat beside Clara and listened to her talk about a new connection she'd established with a women's organization in the territorial capital that might allow them to formalize some of what the ranch was already doing, give it a legal structure, a name. What would we call it? Evelyn asked. Clara thought about it. Something that doesn't sound like an institution, she said. Something that sounds like what it is. What it is, Evelyn said, is a place where people can put things down for a while. Clara looked at her. Then maybe it should be called that. Late in the afternoon, Garrett appeared from the direction of the barn where he had been with deliberate and considerate tact spending most of the day, leaving the gathering to be what it needed to be. He came across the yard in the long June light and was immediately commandeered by the children who had decided that a tall, quiet man with horses was exactly what their afternoon required. He submitted to this with the equanimity of someone who had lived long enough to understand that children were usually right about what an afternoon required. Evelyn watched him from the porch, watched him crouch down to the level of the smallest child, watched him point toward the barn and say something that produced universal delight, watched him lead the small delegation toward the horses with the patient, unhurried walk of someone who had all the time in the world for this. Ruth Palliser appeared beside her. He's a good man, Ruth said. He is, Evelyn agreed simply, without qualification. You seem... Ruth paused, looking for the word. You seem different from the woman who sat down at Prine's table and told her story. Harder, then. I don't mean that unkindly. No, Evelyn said. You're right. I was hard then, because hard was what the situation required. She watched Garrett lift the smallest child so she could see over the paddock fence. I didn't know then that you could be strong without being hard. I thought they were the same thing. I was confusing armor with backbone. Ruth was quiet for a moment. What's the difference? Armor keeps everything out, Evelyn said. Backbone holds you up while you let things in. The sun was moving toward the western ridge now, taking the afternoon with it in the slow, gorgeous way of summer evenings on the frontier. Light going gold, then amber, stretching shadows long across the range, making everything it touched look slightly more significant than it had in the direct light of noon. Evelyn looked out at her land. She still had to catch herself doing that, claiming it as hers, when it was Garrett's legally and theirs in every practical sense. She was working on that. The claiming. The willingness to say mine about good things, when for so long the only things she'd been allowed to claim were the failures and the problems and the evidence of her own supposed inadequacy. This was hers. This afternoon, these women, this land, this life, in the process of becoming itself, all of it was hers, earned not through suffering, but through refusing to let the suffering be the final word. She was 51 years old. She had a scar that ran from her temple to her jaw and a metal box sitting empty on the shelf in the new house office, and a man who had ridden blind through a frozen ravine for her, and a life that looked nothing like anything she'd planned and everything like what she'd needed. She had thought for a long time that arriving at this age meant arriving at what remained, that 51 was a reckoning point, a place where you counted what you'd lost and what you had left and found a way to be sufficient with the difference. She had carried that belief through years of marriage, and through the fire, and through 18 months of cold roads and borrowed rooms, and a metal box that sometimes felt like it weighed more than the rest of her combined. She had been wrong about that. 51 was not where life wound down. It was not a closing. It was, It turned out exactly what she was standing inside. A June afternoon full of voices and children and the particular quality of light that makes ordinary things look like they matter, which they did, which they always had, which she was only now fully able to see. Garrett came back from the paddock without the children, who had apparently decided that the horses themselves were sufficient company and could be trusted with young persons of good intentions. He came across the yard and up the porch steps and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders were touching, looking out at the same view. "Good day," he said. "Yes," she said. "Very good." He looked at her profile. She could feel it, that familiar, steady, non-intrusive attention that was one of the things she loved about him, the way he looked at her without needing her to be anything other than what she was at the precise moment he was looking. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't," she said. "Ask me how I feel. I've told you everything I feel today, just not all of it in words." "I wasn't going to ask how you feel," he said. "I was going to ask if you'd eaten anything since noon, because I've been watching you go from person to person for 4 hours, and I'm fairly certain you fed everyone here except yourself." She blinked. Thought about it. He was absolutely right. "Come inside," he said. "There's soup left from this morning. Sit down and eat it, while there's still light enough to see by." She looked at him. The amber light was in his face, and the years were in his face, and the quiet certainty of someone who had made a decision and built a life from it and was daily confirmed in the rightness of the decision. All of that was in his face, legible to her now in the way that the faces of the people we love become legible over time, a language you learn by living alongside its speaker. "Yes, all right," she said. They went inside together through the door of the house they had built from the ground up on the ground of his burned ranch, into the warmth of a kitchen that smelled like the afternoon's cooking and the particular domestic smell of a place that was genuinely lived in. The voices of the women outside drifted in through the open window. A fragment of laughter, someone calling a child's name, the sound of a gathering winding toward its close. Evelyn sat down at the table. Garrett put soup in front of her and sat across from her and poured 2 cups of coffee, and the evening light came through the kitchen window and lay itself across the table in long, warm bars. She ate. Outside, the last of the June afternoon was going golden over the western ridge. Inside the house on the rebuilt ranch in Benton County, in the kitchen that faced east toward the open range, a woman sat across a table from a man she trusted and ate her soup and let the good day be good. The metal box was on the shelf in the office, empty. The letters it had held were in a courthouse record, permanent and irrevocable and true. 12 women's words had been said in a room built for the saying of true things, and the world they lived in had shifted, incompletely and imperfectly and unmistakably, in the direction of something better. What grows from ash, Evelyn thought, sitting there in the good light, doesn't grow in spite of the burning. It grows because the burning cleared the ground. Because sometimes the clearing, as terrible as it is the only thing that makes space for what was always trying to grow. She looked at Garrett across the table. He was looking back at her with that same open steadiness, no agenda, no performance, just a man being present in the specific moment he was living in. "Thank you," she said. He didn't ask what for. He seemed to understand that it was for all of it. The ravine, and the warmth, and the soup, and the staying, and the steady presence, and the life that had turned out to be possible when she had stopped believing anything good was. "Same," he said simply. The evening settled around the house like something that had been waiting to arrive. The voices outside grew quieter, the children were called in. The gathering began its gentle dissolution into goodbyes and safe roads home, and the particular bittersweet ending of days that have been fully used. And Evelyn Mercer, who had survived the unsurvivable and carried the uncarryable and arrived at 51 years old with her scars and her backbone and her empty box and her full life, sat in the good light and finished her soup and was, at last, entirely at home. End of Part 5. End of Evelyn's Ashes.